In MiG Alley, the Korean War became a laboratory, new tactics, new technology, and a rivalry that could not afford a mistake. Somewhere over the frozen landscape of northwestern Korea, a pilot checked his instruments and scanned the sky ahead. The briefing that morning had been clear. This corridor of airspace was where the enemy concentrated. This was where the most advanced aircraft on both sides met at speeds that left no margin for hesitation. This was where the lessons of air combat were being rewritten in real time, paid for in fuel and blood and the unforgiving arithmetic of who saw whom first. The war had begun on the ground, with infantry and armor and the brutal arithmetic of territorial control. But as the conflict dragged on without decisive resolution, a different kind of battle emerged in the skies above. A battle that would shape what was possible for the forces below. A battle that would test machines and doctrines that had never faced each other in combat. A battle that would determine whether the flow of supplies and reinforcements could be interrupted or protected. This is the story of that air war, not as a catalog of aircraft specifications or a tally of victories and losses, but as a story of adaptation under pressure, of men and machines pushed to limits that peacetime training could not fully prepare them for, of a rivalry between systems that extended far beyond the cockpits of the pilots who fought it. Archival records and pilot accounts from this period reveal something more complex than simple heroism or technological superiority. They reveal a learning process that happened in compressed time, where mistakes were fatal and improvements had to come fast. The controllers who guided aircraft from primitive radar stations. The mechanics who kept jets flying in brutal cold. The intelligence officers who pieced together enemy capabilities from fragments of wreckage and debriefings. The commanders who adjusted tactics based on what worked and what got pilots killed. Years later, veterans would describe MiG Alley in terms that combined respect for the danger with pride in what they had learned to do. The enemy was capable. The conditions were demanding. The stakes were measured in lives and in the broader question of whether air power could deliver what the ground forces needed. This is not an episode about every mission or every engagement. It is an episode about how a new kind of air combat emerged from the pressure of actual war, about what happened when jet fighters met in numbers for the first time, about the human and institutional capacity to adapt faster than the enemy. In MiG Alley, learning faster was survival. To understand why the air war mattered, you have to understand what it was supposed to accomplish. The purpose of air power in Korea was not abstract. It was tied directly to what was happening on the ground, where the real territorial struggle was being fought. The ground war had settled into a pattern that neither side could break decisively. Lines moved forward and back. Attacks were launched and repelled. The casualties mounted on both sides without producing the kind of breakthrough that would end the conflict quickly. In this grinding reality, the ability to move supplies, reinforce positions, and sustain operations became as important as the ability to attack. This was where air power entered the equation. The missions fell into categories that pilots and planners understood in concrete terms. Interdiction meant attacking the routes that brought supplies and reinforcements to the front. Bridges, rail lines, road junctions, convoy assembly areas, anything that kept the enemy's war machine fed and functional. Close air support meant providing firepower directly to ground forces engaged with the enemy, attacking positions that infantry could not reach or neutralize on their own. Escort meant protecting the bombers and attack aircraft that carried out these missions from the fighters that would try to stop them. Reconnaissance meant gathering the intelligence that made all the other missions possible. Each of these missions depended on a fundamental condition: control of the air, or at least enough control to operate without prohibitive losses. If enemy fighters could intercept bombers and attack aircraft at will, the cost of every mission would rise until the missions became unsustainable. If enemy aircraft could operate freely over friendly positions, the ground forces would face threats they could not counter. On a road winding through mountain passes south of the battle lines, a convoy of trucks moved supplies toward forward positions. The drivers kept their eyes on the sky as much as on the road ahead. They had learned what it meant when air cover was present and what it meant when it was absent. The difference was not theoretical. It was the difference between arriving and burning. Above the convoy, unseen but present, a flight of fighters maintained a patrol pattern that kept the road under protection. The pilots could see the dust rising from the trucks below. They knew what was in those trucks and where it was going. Their job was to ensure it got there. In a command post behind the lines, an operations officer reviewed the day's mission schedule. The board showed dozens of sorties planned for the next 24 hours. Bomber formations heading north to hit supply depots. Fighter sweeps to clear the corridors those bombers would fly through. Reconnaissance flights to photograph the results and identify new targets. Close support missions on call for ground commanders who needed immediate help. Each mission was a piece of a larger system. The system worked only if the pieces could function without being destroyed. That meant the air battle was not separate from the ground war. It was the condition that made the ground war sustainable. Air power did not replace the ground war. It shaped the limits of what the ground war could achieve. The corridor that became known as MiG Alley was not chosen arbitrarily. It existed because of geography, logistics, and the logic of where opposing forces had to meet. The northwestern corner of the Korean peninsula lay close to boundaries that the war's political constraints made significant. Beyond those boundaries were sanctuaries where enemy aircraft could base, train, and prepare without fear of attack. The bombers and attack aircraft that flew interdiction missions against supply routes in the north had to pass through this region. The fighters assigned to protect them had to operate here, and the enemy fighters tasked with stopping them had to intercept here, in this relatively narrow band of airspace where the geometry of the missions forced contact. The terrain below was mountainous and largely empty of the infrastructure that defined more developed regions. Rivers carved valleys that pilots used as navigation references. The Yalu River formed a boundary that aircraft were forbidden to cross, creating a line that everyone knew and that shaped every tactical calculation. From certain altitudes, pilots could see across that boundary to the airfields where enemy jets were based, tantalizingly close and absolutely off-limits. This geography created a funnel. Everything that mattered flowed through this corridor, the bombers heading to targets, the fighters escorting them, the enemy fighters rising to intercept. The air battles that resulted were not random encounters across a vast theater. They were concentrated in this strip of sky where both sides knew the other would be. In a briefing room before dawn, a flight leader walked his pilots through the day's mission, using a map that everyone in the room had memorized. His finger traced the route they would fly, the checkpoints they would use for navigation, the area where they expected to encounter opposition. He tapped a rectangular section of the map marked with grease pencil. "This is where you stay sharp," he said without drama. "Everything outside this area is transit. Inside this area is where they come from and where they go back to. Inside this area is where you find them or they find you." The pilots studied the map in silence. Some had been here before and knew what to expect. Others were newer and were absorbing everything they could. The briefing covered fuel states, weapons loadouts, radio procedures, emergency protocols. Nothing was left to assumption because assumptions killed people. A weather officer provided the morning forecast. Cloud cover would be variable. Visibility in the target area would depend on conditions that could change by the hour. The pilots noted the information and factored it into their mental preparation. Weather in MiG Alley was not just a flying condition. It was a tactical variable that could determine whether you saw the enemy in time, or whether the enemy saw you first. A war can have many fronts. Sometimes the most dangerous one is a strip of sky. The aircraft that met over Korea represented a new era in military aviation. They were not the propeller-driven fighters that had dominated the skies of the last war. They were jets, powered by engines that produced thrust through entirely different principles, and that enabled performance that previous generations of aircraft could not approach. The implications of this change were profound and took time to fully understand. Speed increased dramatically. Where propeller fighters had fought at 300 or 400 miles per hour, jets routinely operated at 600 or more. The closure rate when two jets approached each other head-on could exceed 1,000 miles per hour. A speck on the horizon became a lethal threat in seconds. Altitude ceilings rose with the new technology. The thin air that had limited earlier aircraft was no longer as constraining. Combat could happen at heights where the sky turned dark blue and the curvature of the earth became visible. The time available to make decisions compressed accordingly. What had been seconds of warning became fractions of seconds. The margin for error that pilots had relied on in earlier conflicts largely disappeared. In the merge, everything happened at once. You blinked and the geometry was gone. The aircraft that had been in front of you was now behind you, or above you, or gone entirely. The closure rate meant that the window for a firing solution was measured in heartbeats. Miss that window and you were the one being tracked. The American aircraft that came to dominate the air war was the F-86 Sabre. It was a swept-wing jet designed to operate at high speeds and high altitudes. Its pilots sat in a cockpit that gave them good visibility for the kind of situational awareness that air combat demanded. Its controls were responsive enough to allow the maneuvering that dogfighting required. It was not perfect, no aircraft is, but it was capable in the hands of pilots who knew how to use it. The aircraft it faced was the MiG-15. This was a design that had emerged from post-war research and rapid engineering development, influenced by technical advances that multiple countries had contributed to. It was swept-wing, jet-powered, and capable of performance that shocked Western observers when they first encountered it. In some respects, it outperformed the Sabre. It could climb faster and operate comfortably at higher altitudes. In other respects, the Sabre had advantages. It was more stable in certain maneuvers, and its gun sight was generally considered superior for the deflection shooting that air combat required. The comparison between these aircraft would be debated endlessly by pilots, historians, and enthusiasts. The truth was that neither aircraft was so dominant that pilot skill and tactical circumstances became irrelevant. The outcome of any given engagement depended on who saw whom first, who had the altitude and energy advantage, who made the critical decisions correctly under the pressure of combat that compressed everything into moments. In a maintenance hangar, a technical officer examined components recovered from a downed enemy aircraft. The wreckage had been brought back at considerable risk, transported by ground units who understood its intelligence value. Every piece revealed something about enemy manufacturing, design philosophy, and capabilities. The officer made careful notes and photographs. The engine design showed influences that Western engineers recognized and some elements that required further analysis. The airframe construction revealed choices about weight and strength that had tactical implications. The gun sight and other cockpit instruments suggested how the enemy trained pilots and what they expected them to do in combat. This kind of analysis was ongoing throughout the conflict. Every piece of recovered equipment was another data point in understanding what the enemy could do and where vulnerabilities might exist. But technology alone did not determine outcomes. The jets met in an environment where speed and altitude were only part of the equation. Ground-based radar could track aircraft and guide fighters toward intercepts. Controllers sitting in bunkers miles from the combat could see patterns that pilots in the air could not see. The integration of ground control with airborne fighters created a system that was more capable than either element alone. In a radar facility carved into a hillside, controllers watched screens that showed the tracks of aircraft moving through the contested airspace. The blips were abstract representations of machines traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, but the controllers had learned to read them with understanding that came from experience and training. A controller spoke into his radio, giving vectors to a flight of Sabres. He could see what the pilots could not: enemy aircraft climbing from the north, probably heading for an intercept on the bomber formation that was the day's main effort. He guided the friendly fighters toward a position that would give them advantage when the merge happened. The pilots followed his instructions, adjusting their heading and altitude. They trusted the controller because the system worked. Previous missions had proven that the information from the ground was accurate and timely. The integration of radar control with fighter operations was one of the advantages that American forces developed and refined throughout the conflict. Jets made combat faster. They also made discipline non-negotiable. The air war over Korea was not won by technology alone or by individual heroism alone. It was won by institutional adaptation, by the capacity of units and the larger force structure to identify what worked, abandon what did not, and spread successful methods as quickly as possible. This adaptation happened at every level. Individual pilots developed personal techniques through survival and observation. Flight leaders identified tactics that gave their formations advantages. Squadron commanders established procedures that reduced losses and increased effectiveness. The entire system captured lessons and disseminated them to new pilots rotating into the theater. The briefing and debriefing process was central to this improvement. Every mission that returned was analyzed. What happened? What worked? What went wrong? Where were the enemy aircraft encountered? What were they doing? How did they respond to different tactics? The information was collected, compared, and used to update the standard procedures that governed how missions were flown. In a squadron-ready room after a mission, pilots gathered for the debrief. The flight leader stood at a chalkboard that showed rough diagrams of the engagement. He walked through the sequence of events, using the diagrams to illustrate how the fight had developed. The initial contact had come as expected, in the corridor where radar had tracked the enemy building up. The Sabres had been in good position, with altitude and sun angle in their favor. The merge had been violent and brief. Shots were fired, claims were made. Then the enemy broke off and the Sabres, low on fuel, returned to base. The debrief was not about celebrating, it was about extracting information. What did the enemy do that was different from previous encounters? Were there new tactics being employed? How did the formations hold together during the fight? What could be done better next time? A newer pilot asked a question about the decision to brake right rather than left during one phase of the engagement. The flight leader explained the reasoning. The position of the sun, the relative energy states of the aircraft involved, the need to keep visual contact with a wingman who was in a vulnerable position. Every choice had reasons. Understanding those reasons was how the newer pilots would eventually become flight leaders themselves. Fuel was the tyranny that governed everything. MiG Alley fights ended because fuel ended. A Sabre could stay in the combat area for only so long before it had to turn south or risk not making it home. This constraint shaped tactics at every level. You could not chase an enemy indefinitely. You could not loiter waiting for opportunities. Every minute in the combat zone was a minute subtracted from your return margin. A pilot watched his fuel gauge drop during an engagement, knowing that the numbers defined his options as surely as the enemy did. He had enough for perhaps 5 more minutes of combat maneuvering. After that, he would have to break off regardless of how the fight was going. You could win the merge and still die if you could not get home. The fuel constraint created tactical dynamics that both sides learned to exploit. Fresh flights arriving with full tanks could press advantages against opponents who had been fighting longer. The timing of missions had to account for how long aircraft could remain effective in the combat area. The entire rhythm of the air battle was shaped by this fundamental limitation. Rules of engagement added another layer of complexity. The political constraints on the conflict meant that not every action that might have been tactically advantageous was permitted. The boundaries that aircraft could not cross, the targets that could not be attacked, the situations where restraint was required regardless of tactical opportunity. A pilot tracked a damaged MiG heading north, trailing smoke. His instincts screamed to pursue and finish the kill. The enemy was vulnerable. Another few seconds of pursuit would put him in position for a decisive burst. But the MiG was approaching the line, the boundary beyond which pursuit was forbidden. His wingman's voice crackled in his headset. "Break off, you're too close." The pilot's hand hesitated on the controls. Everything in his training as a fighter pilot told him to press the advantage. Everything in his briefing that morning told him to stop. The line existed for reasons that had nothing to do with this moment, and everything to do with a larger war that no one wanted to trigger. He broke off. The MiG disappeared across the boundary. Another claim that would go unconfirmed. Another frustration to carry back to base. Another reminder that this war was fought within limits that both sides observed, limits that sometimes let enemies escape. These rules had to be absorbed and followed even in the chaos of high-speed combat. The temptation to pursue was intense. The discipline required to stop was absolute. The consequences of crossing the line could extend far beyond any single engagement. Training programs evolved continuously to incorporate the lessons being learned in combat. Pilots who rotated out of Korea after completing their tours often went to training commands where their experience shaped how the next generation was prepared. The tactics that worked in MiG Alley became standard instruction. The mistakes that had gotten pilots killed became case studies in what to avoid. In MiG Alley, the best weapon was not the jet. It was the capacity to adapt. The air battle over Korea was not simply a technical competition between aircraft. It was an extension of the larger Cold War rivalry into a domain where the stakes were immediate and the consequences were measurable. Every engagement carried implications that extended beyond the tactical outcome. Both sides understood that what happened in the skies over Korea would shape perceptions of relative capability. A decisive advantage in air combat would suggest broader conclusions about which system produced better technology, better training, better pilots. The propaganda value of aerial victory was significant, and both sides crafted narratives around the claims and counterclaims that emerged from the fighting. The claims themselves were inherently uncertain. In the chaos of high-speed combat, it was often impossible to confirm whether an enemy aircraft had actually been destroyed. A pilot might report seeing an opponent trailing smoke and descending, but whether that aircraft crashed or recovered was rarely known with certainty. Both sides had incentives to report favorably, and the verification methods available were imperfect. Years later, when archives were partially opened and records could be compared, the picture that emerged was more complex than either side's wartime claims had suggested. Some victories that had been counted were probably not actual kills. Some losses that had been concealed or minimized were revealed. The exact tallies remain subjects of scholarly debate, with different methodologies producing different figures that historians continue to examine. What was clear was that both sides lost aircraft and pilots. The fighting was real and costly regardless of which interpretation of the numbers one accepted. The experience of combat was not altered by post-war debates about statistics. In an intelligence section behind the lines, an analyst worked to piece together an understanding of enemy capabilities and operations. He had photographs from reconnaissance flights. He had debriefings from pilots who had observed enemy aircraft in flight. He had technical reports on recovered wreckage. He had communications intercepts that revealed fragments of enemy procedure. The picture was incomplete. The enemy was not cooperative in revealing its secrets. Claims in propaganda broadcasts were assumed to be exaggerated. The challenge was to separate signal from noise, to identify patterns that revealed truth from patterns that were deception or simple error. One question that occupied considerable attention was the identity of the enemy pilots. The aircraft were clearly Soviet-designed and built, but who was flying them in combat? Some evidence suggested that pilots from beyond the immediate theater were involved. Radio intercepts occasionally captured communications in languages that raised questions. Recovered materials sometimes contained markings that suggested broader origins than the countries officially at war. Western accounts would later describe involvement by pilots from the Soviet Union itself, though the full extent and official acknowledgement remained contentious for decades. At the time, the matter was handled with characteristic Cold War obliqueness. Both sides had reasons to limit public acknowledgement of direct superpower confrontation. The fiction was maintained that the air battle was being fought by forces of the countries officially at war, even as evidence accumulated that the reality was more complex. This ambiguity served political purposes for everyone involved. Escalation was constrained by the willingness to maintain deniability. The war in the air remained contained within bounds that prevented it from triggering the wider conflict that no one wanted. In the Cold War, even a dogfight had diplomatic weight. The air war was fought by machines, but it was sustained by people. The pilots who climbed into cockpits every day did so knowing that each mission might be their last. The ground crews who maintained the aircraft worked in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The support personnel who kept the entire system functioning performed their roles without the visibility or recognition that combat brought. The psychological burden on pilots was significant. The missions were repetitive in structure but unpredictable in outcome. The same corridor was flown again and again. The same procedures were followed, but each time the encounter with the enemy was different. The stress of not knowing whether today's mission would be uneventful or fatal accumulated over time. Some pilots flew dozens of missions without encountering the enemy in a way that led to combat. Others found themselves in dogfights on their first or second time over the corridor. The randomness of contact added to the psychological difficulty. There was no way to control whether you would face danger on any given day. You could only prepare as well as possible and trust in training and equipment and the men flying with you. A pilot sat in his quarters the evening before a scheduled mission, writing a letter to his family. He chose his words carefully, balancing the desire to reassure with the need to express something genuine. The letters home were exercises in managed honesty. You did not describe the fear in detail. You did not enumerate the losses among friends. But you also did not pretend that everything was routine. The ground crews worked in conditions that tested everything. The cold in Korea during winter was savage. Equipment that functioned perfectly in temperate conditions failed or malfunctioned. Fuel became sluggish. Lubricants thickened. Metal became brittle. The crews adapted, developing techniques and workarounds that kept the aircraft flying despite the environment. On a flight line before dawn, a mechanic completed the final checks on an aircraft that had required overnight maintenance. His hands were raw from the cold despite the gloves he wore. The tools he used had to be handled carefully to avoid the skin-freezing contact with metal. He had been awake for most of the night, working by flashlight and trouble lamp to repair a hydraulic system that had developed a leak. The aircraft was ready. The pilot who would fly it would never know the full story of what had been done to make it airworthy. The mechanic did not expect recognition. He expected the aircraft to perform, and he expected to do the same work tomorrow and the day after for as long as the war continued. The turnaround cycle was relentless. A Sabre would land from a mission, taxi to its revetment, and immediately begin the process of preparation for the next flight. Fuel trucks moved into position. Ammunition was checked and replenished. Crew chiefs swarmed over the aircraft looking for damage, leaks, anything that needed attention before the next launch. A pilot climbed out of his cockpit, stiff from the cold and the tension of combat. Another pilot was already walking toward the same aircraft. In 30 minutes, the jet would be climbing back toward the corridor. The machine did not rest. The system demanded continuous output. The men who kept that system running understood their role without needing speeches to explain it. Every aircraft that launched was their work. Every pilot who returned safely owed something to their attention and skill. Every mission that succeeded depended on things that happened on the ground before the jet ever left it. Wars are won by systems. Systems are built by people. The air campaign over Korea achieved significant results within the constraints that governed it. The interdiction of enemy supply lines was never complete, but it complicated the enemy's logistics throughout the conflict. The protection of friendly ground forces from enemy air attack was largely successful, creating conditions where ground operations could proceed without the constant threat from above. But air power had limits that became clear over time. The ability to disrupt supply lines did not translate into the ability to stop the war. The enemy adapted, moving supplies at night, dispersing storage, using routes and methods that were difficult to interdict. The bombing campaigns produced damage but not capitulation. The air superiority that American forces achieved allowed them to conduct operations that would otherwise have been impossible, but it did not by itself produce the decisive outcome that would end the conflict on favorable terms. This was a lesson that would echo through subsequent conflicts. Air power could create conditions favorable to surface operations. It could impose costs on the enemy. It could protect friendly forces and project power over great distances. But it could not compel an enemy to accept terms he was determined to resist. The decision to continue or end a war was ultimately political. And politics had dynamics that bombs and fighters could influence but not control. In a planning meeting at a higher headquarters, officers reviewed the results of recent operations and debated future priorities. The maps showed the bomb damage assessments. The charts showed sortie rates and loss rates. The briefings summarized what had been accomplished and at what cost. A senior officer asked the question that everyone was thinking. Were they winning the air war? The answer required qualification. They were achieving tactical objectives. They were maintaining pressure on enemy supply lines. They were preventing the enemy from achieving air superiority and using it against friendly forces. But they were not achieving strategic decision. The stalemate on the ground was matched by something similar in the air campaign's ability to force an outcome. The discussion turned to what more could be done. But the constraints remained. The political boundaries could not be crossed. The targets that might have had greater impact were off limits. The war was being fought within limits that both sides observed, partly from caution about escalation, and partly from calculations about what each side was willing to risk. Air superiority could shape a war. It could not, by itself, end it. The legacy of MiG Alley extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The lessons developed over Korea shaped how air forces around the world thought about jet combat, training, and doctrine for decades afterward. The tactics refined in the skies over that frozen peninsula became the foundation for how pilots would be prepared for conflicts that might come. The technology continued to evolve. The jets that fought over Korea were soon superseded by faster, more capable aircraft. The missiles that would replace guns as the primary air-to-air weapon began development in earnest. The radar and control systems that had been improvised under combat conditions were refined and integrated into more sophisticated networks. But the fundamental insights remained valid long after the specific equipment became obsolete. The importance of training and discipline, the value of institutional adaptation, the integration of ground control with airborne operations, the recognition that technology provided capabilities but that human performance determined whether those capabilities were effectively employed. The men who had fought in MiG Alley carried their experiences with them. Those who went to training commands passed on what they had learned. Those who rose to higher ranks brought their combat perspectives to decisions about force structure and doctrine. Those who left the service entirely still carried memories that would never fade. The air war over Korea demonstrated what jet fighters could do and what they could not do. It proved that air superiority mattered for everything that happened below. It showed that disciplined, well-trained forces could prevail against capable opposition. It revealed the limits of air power as a tool for achieving political objectives that the enemy was determined to resist. The skies over MiG Alley had been a crucible where new forms of warfare were tested under the most demanding conditions. The costs of those tests were measured in lives that ended over the frozen ridges and river valleys of northwestern Korea. The results shaped military thinking for generations. In MiG Alley, the scoreboard mattered. But it was not the scoreboard that ended the fighting. The sky could shape the war. It could not sign the outcome. Air superiority shaped what was possible on the ground. But it did not deliver a clean victory. The next file is how Korea finally stopped, and what that stop really meant.